for showing up and for participating. As you can probably imagine, this is one of those kind of titles that one thinks of, mainly thinking of, wouldn't it be great if somebody really qualified did a presentation on this subject? And then realizing later that, oh my God, I just volunteered for it myself. What do I do now? And, panic, and should I leave the country? Or, oh, but that's the problem because they have internet in other countries, so I can't run away. But anyway, I guess I was thinking of it. I've been thinking about this subject, I guess, all my life, in a way that that there's something that happens when one reads the metaphysics of the Secret Doctrine, when someone studies and spends time with and admiring the sheer beauty of the stanzas of Xian. And I think that we all kind of resonate in a way, and we all kind of know that there's something mystical that happens. What you call it, whether you call it contemplation or meditation, these are just words, but something happens where there is a communion with these great ideas and a sense of wonder and a sense of awe, a sense of timelessness. And my term for that was mystic meditation. Perhaps I should have called it metaphysics and the journey of the mystic. That might be something a little bit more approachable. But actual mystic meditation, well, we'll see what we can do with that, okay? And then I'm looking forward in the Q&A to learning from all you guys too. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here, because I do have a keynote thing. And I'm going to hit play. Do you all see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So in popular culture, meditation, classified as mystic, at least on the internet, it tends to promise a host of superpowers. Now, people who are steeped in theosophy and have been reading HPB and others, Krishnamurti, other prominent thinkers and poets and metaphysicians in the theosophical world, know that mystic meditation is something much deeper, much more powerful, what's much more putting one in contact with one's own immortality than this host of superpowers that I put up on the screen here. But popularly, the things you get when you do mystic meditation are knowledge of past lives, you get powers of healing, you get telepathy, you get visions of other lands, you become able to see the future, maybe you'll be able to levitate, and you get all kinds of wish fulfillment. Now, what I'm going to try to do is to prove that in a way, when it comes to our deepest selves, even though we may laugh at these things, you get these things anyway, but in a more deeper, more transpersonal, impersonal, and in a more deeply compassionate way. Let's see here. Do I have to click? Oh, there we go. Part of my thinking on this subject has to do with on Sunday mornings in San Diego, which is about 2 hours from now, at 10:30 in the morning in San Diego time, we do have a class in the Secret Doctrine. And we spent the whole year last year, before we started entertaining the stanzas of Xian, doing certain things that BP Wadia recommends and Commander Bowen recommends, who he says he got straight from HPB, about kind of how to study the Secret Doctrine with reference to reading the preface, the introductory, the proem, the summing up, things like that, and then going into the stanzas. So we did that last year. And as promised, now we're going into the stanzas themselves. So we thought we would try an experiment. The question would be, will we read the stanzas directly with HPB's commentaries, or will we spend time just with the poetry of the stanzas themselves? And we thought we would let it be indeterminate how much time we would spend just with the poetry. And I have found, to my delight and to, I think, everyone else in the class's delight, that we're spending an awful lot of time just soaking, basking in the beauty of these stanzas. Going slow is easier for some than others. Some are kind of in a rush. I would call it rajas, you could say, to get to the official understanding of some of these mysteries that HPB explains about. Someone will rush ahead and say, well, it says on page 51, or like that. And all of that's fine. And we keep promising ourselves, we're going to get there. We're going to get there. And the more we can monastically climb into these ideas and really explore them and do all the analytics and all the synthesis that we want, the better. But meanwhile, we're kind of holding back on all that and just asking questions. Well, what about this? I wonder about that. That word wonder keeps coming up. And that, we think, and I'm hoping, will lay a deeper, more mystical foundation for when we do get into all the analytics and all the, Buddhist and Advaita and Platonic philosophy that HPB is so brilliant at instructing the student in order to understand some of the mystery of these stanzas. So I'm hoping that it'll be like this kind of time spent with the poetry will be, I guess, foundation is a mystical foundation, is the best I can describe it right now. So it has occurred to us that each one of these slokas is like a great tree. And there's in a redwood forest, you could say. And there's different ways to walk through a redwood forest. And I don't know if you have forests like this in Europe. If so, I would like to see one. But this is a redwood forest in Northern California, a grove of great trees, some of which have been there for thousands of years, well, up to 2,000 years. There's two ways, at least, maybe there's more ways of walking through a forest. One would be to stay on the path, of course, and to read all the little signs about the botany, about the ecology, about the interrelatedness, about the science of the flora and the fauna of the forest, of the grove. The other is to do what this young woman's doing. Just admiring the grandeur of it all, just taking it in. Some people would say that it's right brain as opposed to left brain. Whatever it is, it's the idea of realizing how much one does not know, how much there is to know in terms of just the sheer volume of life that exists in nature. And some would call it the ontological plenty, the plenitude of being, and the wonder of it all. Let's see here. Oh, now there is a favorite passage from I think it's a German theologian, Joseph Piper, and Jan Kind is here. He has seen me quote from this guy before. And he talks about a sense of wonder that it's like a faculty. And that it's something that we should cultivate. And it isn't just being mystified or confused. Let's see here. I'm going to, my screen is, I'll try and read this as best as possible. I've got the,
We just minimize the these right here. You get
I can't do it. Oh, you know what I would have to
you
do?
have to hit this minimize.
Okay,
with the
I'll go into
mouse.
escape for a minute. Now I'll minimize
Yeah, now
this.
minimize that.
Now I'll put it back to here.
Yeah.
Sorry about the problem there. So this passage that I love so much reads, wonder signifies that the world is profounder, more all-embracing and mysterious than the logic of everyday reason had taught us to believe. The innermost meaning of wonder is fulfilled in a deepened sense of mystery. It does not end in doubt, but is the awakening of the knowledge that being qua being is mysterious and inconceivable, and that it is a mystery in the full sense of the world, of the word, rather. Neither a dead end, nor a contradiction, nor even something impenetrable and dark. Rather, mystery means that a reality cannot be comprehended because its light, see, it's not darkness. It cannot be comprehended because its light is ever flowing, unfathomable, and inexhaustible. So this is like the opposite of existential scarcity. It's really ontological plenty, that there is a light that is so unfathomable that that is something beyond our rational understandings of things. And that is not to say that we won't eventually understand a mystery. It just is that we don't understand it right now. Now, we've all probably seen this analogy of the idea of the circle in reference to what we know compared to what we don't know. The reason I like to use this idea is that if you look at the inside of the circle and you say that that's an analogy for what we know, or at least what we think we know, then the perimeter is the interface between the known and the unknown being the outside of the circle, and that the perimeter has a given quantity, which would be the amount of the circumference, that as our circle or sphere of knowledge or wisdom increases, that perimeter would increase, wouldn't it? As well as the interface between what's unknown. So as the perimeter increases, the more we realize that we don't know, and how much we don't know. More simply said, the more we know, the more we realize we don't know. How much more would that be of a sphere? As our sphere of knowledge and wisdom increases, and if the outside of the sphere is the unknown, how much more would that interface be of the whole surface of the outside of the sphere as it interfaces with the unknown? Again, the more we know, the more we realize that we don't know. A person who probably helped me, I would say, get tuned in to mysticism and metaphysics is Professor Raghavan Iyer. And he was a theosophist who founded one of the United Lodge of Theosophists. And he edited a magazine called Hermes. And here's a passage from Hermes that has to do with what's going on with metaphysics and ethics and initiation and the intuitive cognitive faculties. He writes, initiation into theosophical metaphysics is more than an intellectual or moral enterprise. It is a continuous spiritual exercise in the development of the intuitive and cognitive capacities that are the highest available to men, and I should say, and women. A process that includes, from the first, a blending of the head and the heart through the interaction of viveka and viragya, discrimination and detachment. And that's like you hear about viveka and viragya in Vedanta. And viveka is discrimination, and viragya is very similar in the voice of the silence to viraga, which is detachment. And that they increase one another. And this idea of an interactive interplay is something that I will be repeating in this presentation. And that's really, instead of me trying to instruct in something, it's me exploring an idea with you all. This idea of centrifugal and centripetal, the dialogue between the higher and the lower, things like that, the dialectic. The Secret Doctrine to me is like a mandala. It's this incredibly vast, stupendous diagram, you could say. And it's a journey to the center. It's not a journey to the center of the book where you look at it and you say, okay, it's got 1,500 pages. So where's page 750? But instead, it's a journey to the center of the spirit of the idea, the spirit of the author, the spirit of the mystic Mahatmas who helped compose the Secret Doctrine, the spirit of the fact that it was actually composed by mystics. So here's something that I found from Tsongkhapa, and I don't see that I have it attributed to Tsongkhapa, but it's from Tsongkhapa, where he writes of a dialogue between Bodhisattva Manjushri and Bodhisattva Vajrapani. And the one on the left is Manjushri, and the scary one on the right is Vajrapani. Manjushri asks of Vajrapani, this vast and profound mandala of the great bodhisattvas, and again, that's one of my theses here, is that the Secret Doctrine is a mandala, is filled with mantras. So it's a mandala of mantras in the Secret Doctrine. And these mantras are there to aid in the retention of meaning. It's difficult to understand, more secret than secrecy itself, and not to be shown to impure sentient beings. You have mentioned it only rarely, O Vajrapani. How can it be explained to those who have not heard it before? I'm fixing my typos. So there's an answer. Vajrapani answered, and he says, Manjushri, those bodhisattvas who practice the bodhisattva path through approaching the secret mantra should first cultivate the altruistic mind of enlightenment. Then they may enter the mandala of mantras, where the initiation into transcendental wisdom is bestowed. So, yes, it's difficult to approach, but according to this teaching, and if you go along with this idea that the Secret Doctrine is a mandala of mantras, cultivation of the altruistic mind of enlightenment will be like a first step. It's like in the voice of the silence. what does it say? The first step has to do with living to benefit mankind, and practicing the 6 glorious virtues is the second. Continuing with this idea of entering a mandala, and this is Tsongkhapa's writing. He says, one should develop both the mind of aspiration, which is reaching upward, and the practical mind of enlightenment, which has to do with, you could say it's more horizontal, because it has to do with spreading love to all of humanity before entering a mandala. Again, I'll read it again. One should develop both the mind of aspiration and the practical mind of enlightenment before entering a mandala. So the aspiration, reaching upward and inward, he writes, if one's mind is not turned away from its fascination with life, it will be an obstacle to the Hinayana and Mahayana paths alike. One should be mindful of death, in that one realizes one will not tarry long in this life. One should consider the incarnations to which fascination can lead, and thereby turn the mind away from focus on this life, probably meaning focusing on the personality. Then he goes on and says, what about the altruistic mind of enlightenment? To go beyond the attitude of seeking the bliss of peace for oneself, one should cultivate over a long time love, compassion, and the altruistic mind of enlightenment. This is like the seed of bodhicitta. Next, one should learn the deeds of the bodhisattva and nurture a wish to train in them. When one can bear the burden of the deeds of the conqueror's sons, one should take the bodhisattva vows and practice their precepts. So there's 2 things that Tsongkhapa is recommending here that can help with cultivating the altruistic mind of enlightenment. One is learning the deeds of what bodhisattvas do, and then saying, how can I be like that? The other is to take the bodhisattva vows and practice their precepts. Now, this may seem like a leap, but I think that this is related to something that HPB wrote in the very beginning of the first volume of the Secret Doctrine, in reference to what she was going to prepare as the 3rd and the 4th volumes of the Secret Doctrine. And there may be some who have thoughts about, what's going on with the 3rd and 4th volume. But I'll just read this passage from her preface, where she says, even the 2 volumes now issued do not complete the scheme, and these do not treat exhaustively of the subjects dealt with in them. A large quantity of material has already been prepared, dealing with the history of occultism as contained in the lives of the great adepts of the Aryan race. And I'm comparing that to Tsongkhapa's studying of the deeds of the bodhisattvas, the history of occultism as contained in the lives of great adepts, and showing the bearing of occult philosophy upon the conduct of life as it is and as it ought to do, as it ought to be. And I'm making the comparison here of Tsongkhapa's 2nd step in the cultivation of the mind of enlightenment as to, let me go back to that slide. This idea of taking the bodhisattva vows and the practice of their precepts. So I just think it's interesting that HPB lays out 2 volumes on metaphysics. And of course, there's a lot of moral and ethical and mystical insights given in those 2 volumes. And the wisdom that's in them is constructed and transmitted by mystics. So in a way, to become in contact with the authors of the Secret Doctrine, and I say plural, because of HPB's relationship with her teachers, is to tune into something mystical, the degree to which one can. And I'm going to go through some of the main paragraphs in the summing up section. And some people call this the 6 items in the summing up section. Others call it the 6 items of cosmogony, for example. Around page 272, I think, in the first volume, something like that. We'll all remember this quote here. The secret doctrine is the accumulated wisdom of the ages, the uninterrupted record covering thousands of generations of seers who had passed their lives in learning, not teaching, by checking, testing, and verifying in every department of nature the independent visions of great adepts who have developed and perfected their physical, mental, psychic, and spiritual organizations to the utmost possible degree. No vision of one adept was accepted until it was checked and confirmed by the visions so obtained as to stand as independent evidence of other adepts and by centuries of experiences. So once again, this you could say is the integration of what we in our modern civilization might call left brain and right brain. But these mystical visions are so much above the brain. But it is the idea of holistic thinking, and then there's analytical thinking. These mystic visions are subjective to the scientific method. And the instruments of the visions are the perfected physical, mental, psychic, and spiritual organizations of mystics to the utmost possible degree. So the whole system, the whole stupendous system is transmitted and learned through mystical experience, but checked and verified by other mystics over the course of centuries. So the next item in the summing up section is this idea of what I'm calling here the radical causality that has been sought by mystics for eons. HPB writes, the fundamental law in that system, this would be number 2, the central point from which all emerged, around and towards which all gravitates, and upon which is hung the philosophy of the rest, is the one homogeneous divine substance principle, the one radical cause. And HPB has this piece of poetry here. I'm not sure if she wrote it or what. She writes, some few whose lamps shone brighter have been led from cause to nature's secret head, and found that one first principle must be. So presumably these are mystics. And in some of these items in the summing up section, I have included poetry or pieces of writing by mystics, in this case Lao Tzu, which I think tend to unlock the metaphysics and that's another point that I think I'm trying to make here, is that mysticism has something to do with unlocking of the mystery of something. Lao Tzu says, look, you cannot see it, it is formless. Listen, you cannot hear it, it is soundless. Grasp, you cannot touch it, it is non-being. These 3 are indiscernible and therefore are merged into the one. Its upper part is not dazzling, its lower part is not dark. It is nameless and in ceaseless motion, and returns to the void. For me, this is talking about the substance principle, the one radical cause. But look what it's basically saying. It's saying Lao Tzu is talking about the importance of understanding what you don't know. And I'm sure that throughout this year, the different speakers have been referring to how much of the stanzas of Xian, especially in the first volume of the Secret Doctrine, are about negation. There's affirmation, but there's a whole lot of negation. We don't know this, we don't know that, this can't be known, etc. But as these stanzas unfold through this process of declaring what one can know and what one doesn't know, there is the unfoldment, the ontological unfoldment of being from darkness and abstract voidness into manifestation. And it's all delivered in the process of talking about what we don't know. The next item of cosmogony in the summing up section, I guess this would be number 3. I've called it veil upon veil. It says the universe is the periodical manifestation of this unknown absolute essence. It is best described as neither spirit nor matter, but both. Parabrahman and Mula Prakriti are one in reality, yet two in the universal conception of the manifested. It appears from the objective standpoint of the one logos as Mula Prakriti and not as Parabrahm. This is getting us used to this idea of a shifting of perspectives, as its veil and not the one reality hidden behind, which is unconditioned and absolute. And there is a piece of poetry from Hermes magazine that says, veil upon veil you hide the wellspring of the infinite. The blue that delights pierces the heart and produces a sapphire jewel. To me, mystical poetry, mystical thinking, mystical reverie is unlocking the beauty, the majesty of these profound, sublime, sacred metaphysics of the Secret Doctrine. I think this one's the 4th, where she talks about Maya. She writes, the universe is called, with everything in it, Maya, because all is temporary therein, from the ephemeral life of a firefly to that of the sun, compared to the eternal immutability of the one and the changelessness of that principle. The universe, with its evanescent, ever-changing forms, must be necessarily, in the mind of a philosopher, no better than a will-o'-the-wisp. Yet the universe is real enough to conscious beings in it, which are as unreal as it is itself. And this has a lot of profound, speaking of philosophers, Advaita Vedanta, Mahayana Buddhism, with the idea of the void, the voidness of the seeming full. And yet, it's a part of it, to me, is unlocked by Chuang-Tzu, who is a mystic. That's another thing that mystics seem to do, is to simplify things into like a direct perception of things, where he writes, I do not know whether it was Chow dreaming that he was a butterfly or the butterfly dreaming that it was Chow. Just this idea of the interplay and the dance, the Leela of the Maya, of the universe. The 5th item of the summing up section is this idea of sentience. Everything in the universe throughout all of its kingdoms is conscious. It's endowed with a consciousness of its own kind, and it's on its own plane of perception. We must remember that because we do not perceive any signs which we can recognize of consciousness, say in stones, we have no right to say that no consciousness exists there. This is a beautiful idea. It's reflective in native cultures throughout the globe. For example, in this Potawatomi chant, is this beautiful idea. It has this idea of motion, and motion is a symbol of that which is living and alive. The earth is moving along. The water is moving along. The grass is moving. The trees are moving. The whole earth is moving. Isn't that beautiful? There's a sense in which intuitive beauty can serve to unlock the stated metaphysical. The last item is what I'm just calling from within outwards. She writes, the universe is worked and guided from within outwards. As above, so it is below, as in heaven, so on earth. And man, the microcosm and miniature copy of the macrocosm, is the living witness to this universal law and to the mode of its action. This idea of will operating in mysterious ways, even at the most sublimest levels of what we would call the unmanifest, but eventually filtering its way down into the manifest. One way of capturing that idea is this thought, I think it's from the 3rd chapter of the Gita, where Krishna says, if I were not indefatigable in action, all men would presently follow my example, O son of Pritha. And then further, in that same summing up section, HPB writes the idea about, she talks about non-separateness. And this is directly a mystical sentiment. But she says that there are some conditions that one has to do to arrive at the full knowledge of non-separateness. And it has to do with the paralyzing of the lower personality. And you can arrive thereby at the full knowledge of the non-separateness of one's higher self from the one absolute self. A human being can, even during his terrestrial life, become like one of the Elohim or the Dhyanis. And once on their plane, the spirit of solidarity and perfect harmony, which reigns in every hierarchy, must extend over him and protect him in every particular. And to me, this is summed up in the very mystical and beautiful idea of Tattvam Asi, thou art that. To me, in approaching any aspect of the Secret Doctrine or any diagram that's in the Secret Doctrine, there's two things that I try and keep in mind, and they're both intimately connected. One is the idea that whatever is being talked about, it's actually describing something that is within the human being. It's within humanity, it's in nature, it's in me, it's in the macrocosm, it's in the microcosm. And the fundamental grounding that helps me, at least, to keep from getting lost in all the details is the idea of I am that. I am the one self. There's no separateness between the higher self, my higher self, and the absolute self. And that, I mean, people talk about getting grounded in different ways. You know, they go walking, they do gardening, you know, they go on vacation, they spend quality time, etc. But the fundamental mystical grounding is this idea of thou art that. And it is something that one can actually remind oneself as one approaches any of these sublime metaphysics. Now, I thought I would just take a look at some basic ideas of what is thought of to be meditation, at least in a Western context. Because after all, meditation is a Western word. I suppose a word in the East would be yoga, I suppose. But let's take a look at this idea of meditation in Christian monasticism and mysticism. And from the early church father Origen, he writes, when you devote yourself to the divine reading, so I'm going to have another slide about this divine reading, and that's the beginning of meditation. Seek the meaning of divine words, which is hidden from most people. And just looking on Wikipedia, this divine reading is called Lectio Divina. And there's 4 aspects to it. First, there's Lectio itself, which is a divine reading, which has to do with feasting on the word. It's like taking a bite. It's tasting something. Then there's meditatio, which would be meditation. It's the idea of chewing on it, digesting it. And this has to do with listening to the inner message. It's listening. And it's also pondering. It's also weighing, gently considering from different angles. I think that that's why we're enjoying in our Secret Doctrine class this idea of not jumping directly into HPB's philosophical explanations and just enjoying the stanzas themselves. There's a certain space that's created in the mind like that. There's a gentle consideration instead of, over intellectualizing things. Do we want to get into the full intellectuality of the Secret Doctrine? Absolutely. You should hear some of these young people in that group. They want to go for it. They're chomping at the bit. But this idea of slowly entering the field is this idea of gently considering things from different angles. Then, moving ahead, there's this idea of oratio, I don't know how to pronounce Latin words, and that's prayer. And that's the mystical side of it, because it's savoring in its essence in a dialogue with God. Presumably, theosophically, that'd be a dialogue with one's own higher self, the God within, the logos within. And then contemplatio, it's making it part of the body and assimilation. Now, this idea of prayer and assimilation both have to do with a slide that's coming up, and it has to do with reaching within and listening to the voice, but it also has to do with assimilation, and we'll get to that in a minute. Before that, I wanted to bring up something from Damodar K. Mavalankar. And speaking of this dialectic that I keep kind of alluding to, which I'll get into more particularly later on, there's the idea of going from above below and from below above. It has to do with deductively working from universals to particulars, which is the Platonic method. And then it has to do with the inductive method of going from the particulars to the universals again, like is considered to be the scientific method. So Mavalankar writes, what the student has first to do is to comprehend these axioms by employing the deductive method to proceed from universals to particulars. He then has to reason from the known to the unknown. And that's a phrase from an article called The Elixir of Life. He's commenting on the Elixir of Life article in HPB's The Theosophist. And he has to reason from the known to the unknown and see if the inductive method of proceeding from particulars to universals supports those axioms. This process forms the primary stage of true contemplation. This, you could say, is a more rational approach, but there's a mystical component, which we're going to get to. Then the other side of it, which is drawn directly from this article, The Elixir of Life and 5 Years of Theosophy, the author, who's unknown, writes, "So it must be with the moral purification of the heart. The basest inclinations must go first, then the others. First avarice, then fear, then envy, worldly pride, uncharitableness, hatred. Last of all, ambition and curiosity must be abandoned successively." So this idea of contemplation includes the purification of the heart. It isn't just cold scientific understanding. The strengthening of the more ethereal and so-called spiritual parts of the man must go on at the same time. Reasoning from the known to the unknown, meditation must be practiced and encouraged. So going backwards inductively from the particulars to the universal, the particular would be the knowns, and the universal will be back to the unknown from where one came. And that this has to do with purification, believe it or not. So it isn't just a rational exercise. So the question is meditation, is it going within, or is meditation going without? I'll give you a hint. I think it's both. So this slide says that meditation is going within, and it has a couple of quotes from different scriptures, you could call them, which support that. In chapter 6, the chapter on meditation, the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says, "To whatever object the inconstant mind goeth out, he should subdue it, bring it back, and place it upon the spirit." So this is a simple idea of gently reinforcing concentration. And there's something about turning inward and concentrating. There's just a phenomenon everybody's experienced. Whenever we try to concentrate, some reason our mind gets distracted and forgets that it's trying to contemplate. Krishna is being very compassionate and saying, whatever the mind goes out to, just bring it back, place it back on the spirit. So this is a conscious exercise in turning within. Then Voice of the Silence is a little more stern, you could say. He who would hear the voice of nada, the soundless sound, and comprehend it, he has to learn the nature of dharana. Dharana has to do with turning inward to the exclusion of all externals. So meditation is obviously has something to do with going in. But you could say that it also has to do with going without. Again, from chapter 6 of the Gita, "But of all devotees, he is considered by me as the most devoted, who, with heart fixed on me, full of faith, worships me." Is Krishna within or is Krishna without? It depends. But it is the idea that there's this dialogue in some ways that Arjuna and Krishna are two different people, at least in the dialogue. And Krishna is saying, become focused on me, which again is a symbol of the higher self. Now, this next quote from the Elixir of Life is perhaps more obvious, that it has meditation is going without. Meditation is the inexpressible yearning of the inner man to go out towards the infinite, which in olden time was the real meaning of adoration. So adoration applies some kind of duality, and the admiration seeking unity. So now this idea of within and without, we think that they have something to do with each other and that there's a dialectic there. Obviously, there's some kind of a dialogue because you have Arjuna and Krishna. Back to metaphysics. Before we go much further with this dialectic of the within, without, the above, below, the centripetal and the centrifugal, I wanted to explore the idea of what is the monad. Whether you think of the monad as the Atma Buddhi, which is in all of life, or as the Atma Buddhi Manas, which is the human monad, you could say. Either way, it's the same thing. The common characteristics is that it's an expression of unity. It's a universal, ubiquitous expression of oneness. Because of that oneness, it's an expression of mirroring. All points mirror all other points, because all points are aspects of the one and naturally mirror one another. All points are are indivisible. And that is another characteristic of the idea of abstract unity, represented by the idea of the monad. And because of that indivisibility in the human being, there's the idea of the thread soul, of that one connection of sacred sutratma that connects all the lifetimes like beads on a thread. So therefore, the idea of the eternal pilgrim is invoked in thinking about the monad. Through all of life's vicissitudes, but there's meaning to life. There's learning, there's growth. There's an eternal sacred pilgrimage that each human being is on. Another thing that, if you look at some of the writings of William Quan Judge, there's the idea that within the monad, there is the divine unlocking of potential. In a way, inherent within the monad, all wisdom and all knowledge already exists there because it's oneness. But there's an unlocking, there's an unfolding that happens. At the same time, and intimately related, there's the gathering of experience. So now I want to explore, I guess what I would say is the first three in the following poem. And then I will explore the last four in something else. So there's a beautiful poem that I found in Hermes magazine. It's anonymous. It's called Any Point. And to me, it has to do with the idea of monadic unity, mirroring, and compassion. It's like going from this abstract idea of the mirroring of monads straight to the idea of this poignant statement of compassion. The writer says, from any point, a line reaches back and attaches to a far distant center. There's no unconnected life in this world, nor a point in time unknown by any other point. This is all very abstract, right? But then it says, nor is there a tear shed in a vacuum. Isn't that moving? You have this idea of divine mirroring, unity, but it's intimately connected with compassion. It's kind of reminiscent of this idea of this Mahayana Buddhist idea about the void. The Dalai Lama talks about this all the time, this intimate connection between the voidness, shunyata, and karuna, compassion. There's wisdom and compassion, and they are like dancing partners, and they help embellish one another. Now I'm going to talk about the other four, about the eternal pilgrim. These are aspects of the monad, remember, and the idea that the human monad is in the process of unfolding as well as gathering experience. Mr. Judge, William Quan Judge, writes in an article called The Synthesis of Occult Science. He writes, it may be conceived that the ego in man is a monad that has gathered to itself innumerable experiences through eons of time, slowly unfolding its latent potencies through plane after plane of matter. It is hence called the Eternal Pilgrim. So look in this first paragraph here, first sentence. There's two things going on: gathering experiences and unfolding latent potencies. To me, unfolding latent potencies is the unfolding from within without, whereas gathering experiences has to do with rounding up experiences, assimilating them, and drawing them inwards, and so that these experiences become the part of the wisdom and the storehouse of wisdom of the reincarnating pilgrim. Now, the same idea of gathering experiences and unfolding is in this other sentence or two here. The human monad or ego is therefore akin to all below it and heir to all above it, linked by indissoluble bonds to spirit and matter, God and nature. The attributes that it gathers and the faculties that it unfolds are but the latent and dormant potentialities awakening to conscious life. So once again, attributes that it gathers and faculties that it unfolds, these are going on within the monad. And to me, what on earth could this have to do with mystic meditation? One of my thesis points that I'm kind of evolving in my mind here is that ultimately, what is going on in mystic meditation is what's going on within the monad. There's an unfolding of wisdom from within, but there's also a turning within and a bringing of experience within, and an aspiration from below going above, you could say, and that it's a dialectic. It's a monadic dialectic, and it's something very beautiful because it's the idea of unfolding and turning within all at the same time, like a dialogue between Krishna and Arjuna. So speaking of this idea, centrifugal and centripetal, I'm not so sure that the exact ideas of Buddhi and Manas are what we're talking about with the monad, but there's definitely a parallel. When we think of Buddhi, it is centrifugal, the energies go outward, whereas Manas is centripetal. You also think of Buddhi as divine discernment. You think of Manas as total concentration. Now, these are all characteristics of mystical experience. Buddhi has expansive sympathy, whereas Manas is pure thought. In Buddhi, there is the intuitive sense of the fitness of things, of justice, of proportion. Manas has the active energy of ideation. But what if you did a marriage, a mystic marriage of the two? What if you combine the beautiful, compassionate, centrifugal energy of Buddhi with the concentrated centripetal energy of turning within of Manas? What if you combined divine discernment with total concentration? What if you combined in a marriage expansive sympathy with pure thought? What if you combined an intuitive sense of the fitness of things, justice and proportion, with the active energy of ideation? I think you would end up with a Mohandas K. Gandhi, or you'd end up with a Henry David Thoreau, or you'd end up with an H.P. Blavatsky, if you combined such these energies, these inward and outward, upward and downward energies. There's another aspect of this idea of the monad, and it has to do with these overbrooding dhyani that is within and above us, that is both within us and outside, you could say. It's outside the persona. That's pointed to in this idea in the voice of the silence. It says, fix thy soul's gaze upon the star whose ray thou art, the flaming star that shines within the lightless depths of ever being, the boundless fields of the unknown. So that obviously is a mystical allusion to the idea of this over brooding God that is within us and above us. Speaking of this idea of within and without, this paragraph here, talking about karma and destiny and so forth, seems to turn on its head the whole idea of what is within and what is without. HPB talks about, yes, our destiny is written in the stars, but then she starts talking about the celestial prototype, and another place she refers to it as the monadic star. She says, the closer the union between the mortal reflection man and his celestial prototype, the less dangerous the external conditions and subsequent reincarnations, which neither Buddhas or Christ can escape. Okay, she says there are external and internal conditions which affect the determination of our will upon our actions. And it is in our power to follow either of the two. Destiny is guided either by the heavenly voice of the invisible prototype outside of us. Isn't that weird? This heavenly voice, this invisible prototype, which is the heavenly voice, in this context is outside of us. We can go that way, or we can listen to and go follow our more intimate astral, the inner man, who is but too often the evil genius of the embodied entity called man. Both these lead on the outward man, but one of them must prevail. So, I mean, in some ways, it's obvious that both of these kinds of proclivities are to be found within, right? Why would she say that the invisible prototype, this monadic star, the celestial prototype, this heavenly voice, is outside of us? Probably it has to do with this word intimate. The lower astral lunar self, the persona, is more intimate to us. It is most often what we mean by when we say the word I, just in normal life. And so therefore, a heavenly voice, this monadic star, is kind of psychologically, existentially, something that is kind of at least perceived to be outside of us. And speaking of this heavenly voice, there's a beautiful passage from an article called The Pledge of Kuan Yin from Raghavan Iyer. And he writes about this idea of the voice of Kuan Yin. There is a latent Kuan Yin in every human being. It is the voice of conscience at the commonest level. It is the chitkala of the developed disciple. At the highest level, it is nada, the voice of the silence, the soundless sound. That which is comprehended in initiation and ceaselessly reverberates in the anahata, the deathless center of the human body, transformed into a divine temple. It's a beautiful passage. And this idea of there's the voice of Kuan Yin, the voice of conscience. Remember, Kuan Yin is she who hears the cries of the suffering of all of humanity. And so in that way, it's the voice of conscience. Gandhi and Socrates both talked about the daimon. Socrates referred to it as the daimon. And Gandhi referred to it, I can't remember how he actually identifies it, but he talks about like an inner voice. And both of them refer to the idea that at first you hear this voice in terms of the voice of conscience, in terms of negation. Don't do it. It's not worth it. Bad idea. Things like that. But as one becomes more attuned to this higher voice within through compassion and tuning oneself into the suffering of humanity, the voice can become within, can be and above, the heavenly voice can be something that is more positive. Do this instead of just don't do this. This is a possibility. Why don't you try it? It's a good idea, like that. So Gandhi said that throughout his life, he began to cultivate and listen to that voice. And that's something very interesting. And it's reminiscent here of this idea of the Chitkala, which becomes the never wavering friend, and assistant of the disciple. And it's really the dhyani that is overbrooding within and above each human being. All human beings have this God within that overbroods and wishes the best for the eternal pilgrim. And speaking of this voice, this guiding voice, it's really the genius, the higher genius within each human being. And we just wanted to go through some of the qualities of a spiritual genius, like an HPB. There's this idea of the genius of HPB, the genius of any spiritual teacher. What are the qualities? The lower manas becomes aligned with manas, and manas becomes a mirror, like it says in the Voice of the Silence, that we need to clean the mirror of buddhi. The spiritual genius knows the archetypal logic between the unknowable, the unmanifest, and the manifest. And this has to do with the humility and the sense of wonder. And that these facilitate this understanding, this unfolding of this archetypal logic. The spiritual genius effortlessly deploys deductive and inductive logic. And again, this has to do with reasoning and thinking things through from universals to particulars, becoming familiar with the great axioms and mantras in the Secret Doctrine, but also this purificatory return back from the known to the unknown, once again, completing the cycle and the circle. A spiritual genius has a certain detached lightness about them as they go through life. They're happy, they're joyful. In a timely way, they're very effective because they're not attached to any aspect of karmic precipitation. So even though they live in a world beyond time, they always have a sense of good timing. The spiritual genius participates compassionately with others in temporal duties of mundane existence. So they're not above normal mundane activities. And it's all part of their compassionate flow as they walk through life. Here's some other qualities that I tried to think through here. If a person was completely ruled by buddhi, what would their manas be like? Their manas would be a translucent mirror for untrammeled manifestation of Atma buddhi. Once again, this idea of cleaning the mirror, purification. Their manas would not identify with the lower principles. They would use them as tools and be compassionate with oneself, but there would not be an identification with that which is lower and personal and petty. They would also be able to, the manas of such a person would be able to subordinate memory patterns, references to the past, an illusion of time broken up to pieces. They would be able to recognize these things when they come into the sphere of one's consciousness. And the manas of a person who is ruled by buddhi would become a truly human being. There'd be a warmth of heart. What would their lower manas be like? The lower manas would be obedient and the precise instrument of the higher manas. The lower manas would be open to honest self-examination, full transparency, no furtiveness, no fugitiveness. The lower manas would be willing to always be guided and directed by the understanding that comes from above and that ought to hold the reins. That's a line from Pythagoras. The lower manas would be happy to participate in the concepts, categories, and languages of any given society in the service of humanity. Because that's what we think of when we think of lower manas, is details, divisions, etc. But there's a place for that. And finally, in the lower manas would be cultivated the germ of bhakti, which is the germ of devotion, of gratitude, of loyalty, of love, and the thirst for divine wisdom. So these are just me thinking through some of these things. Now, going back, I think this is the last slide. And going back to that first slide about what meditation can promise us. And then remember how I mentioned all the superpowers, knowledge of past lives, powers of healing, etc. But this idea of meditation on mystical metaphysics, sublime, sacred metaphysics, such as are offered in the Secret Doctrine. And here I'm claiming that that's tantamount to what Raja Yoga is, which is a combination of Jnana Yoga, which is seeing things, the kernel of things, Karma Yoga, which is putting into practice what we've learned, and Bhakti Yoga, which is the idea of love and devotion. If you put them together, you have Raja Yoga. And I think that that's the heart of meditation on metaphysics. So what would happen? Let's look at these superpowers once again and see if there's been a transmutation. So let's talk about knowledge of past lives. True meditation releases wisdom inherent within the immortal soul. This is a metaphysical statement, but I think that everybody here, just in their own experience, would resonate to that. Just in their own attempts at meditation, there's something released, some kind of wisdom from within that comes out and becomes a part of one's life. Let's look at this idea of the powers of healing. There's nothing more healing than the sense of purpose imbued and released by the ideas of karma, reincarnation, and the pilgrimage of the soul. I'm here for a reason. That is such a beautiful idea, and there's nothing more healing than that, at least to this student. What about telepathy? Well, maybe we can't read the minds of others because we meditated on metaphysics, but this idea of universal unity places one in solidarity with all sentient life, not just in connection with one or a few, but with all sentient life. Maybe that's not telepathy, but there's a resonance, a deeper vibratory connection. Okay, visions of other lands. Here's one of my favorite quotes from Hermes. It says, one may insert oneself by the power of mystic meditation into the universal vision of Shambhala. If one is truly meditating on these mystical metaphysics that were transmitted by the Brotherhood of Bodhisattvas, the community of mystics that HPB refers to, is not one kind of inserting oneself or participating in their universal vision, symbolized by the idea of Shambhala? Is Shambhala someplace really far away? Is it a mystical community of all of those who meditate on these sublime ideas, including Mahatmas? Okay, let's look at seeing the future. The timeless teachings can only become more objective. They will only become more objective to all of humanity as time proceeds. In looking at these ideas in the Secret Doctrine, we're getting a snapshot as to how all of humanity will eventually come to see things. What a remarkable glimpse into the future. And we're not saying that we're better or worse because we study these ideas. It's just an interesting privilege to have a glimpse of the future understanding of humanity in these, as these rounds and races unfold. Someday metaphysics will be commonplace. What about this idea of suspension of gravity? Well, metaphysics does take the practitioner of meditation to higher worlds with an elevated perspective. So in that way, there's an elevation. In a way, a person is putting oneself up in a drone to go up, to take a higher look with a different kind of photography. What about this idea of wish fulfillment? What was that idea that was prevalent a few years ago? I can't remember, but it was the idea that if you focus on something, you get what you want. And it's basically the idea of karma, but it's focusing on karmic good things to happen for oneself. But in the real mystic meditation, there's the idea of divine unity with all of humanity, with all sentient life. And here's a quote from Shantideva that offers a different kind of wish fulfillment. He doesn't worry about being used or abused. He just wants to be here to help others. This is the Bodhisattvic vow. As a matter of fact, he issued a treatise on the way of the Bodhisattva, has become a very famous book. And in that book, he identifies all of the 7 portals that are in the voice of the silence, including viraga, which in normal Buddhism is not included, but he has it. So it's interesting that HPB's precedent is in Shantideva, but he says, may I be a magic jewel, a jar which cannot be drained, a mighty mantra, a true panacea, a wishing tree, and a cow of plenty for all creatures. I'm going to stop sharing here. And now if anyone who wants to do the real sharing. And
thank you very much, Jonathan, for a very inspiring, I would say, an eye-opening way of looking at things. In fact, I would say thank you for sharing your personal thought processes and ways of linking threads, as well as pointing out what I think as a teacher is an extremely useful tool of getting people to ask questions to then formulate answers, which creates a deeper understanding. And it's one thing that's very useful also at high school and university level, to think, what questions will my teacher ask me, so that they prepare the answers for that, which works very, very well when looking at this sort of material. So thank you very much for bringing that up. We now open the floor for questions and comments, of which I'm sure there will be many.